This is my assessment plan by Haley Jorgensen. So, the outcome I chose was USC 7.6 on peer pressure. So, the outcome: demonstrate interpersonal skills, including assertiveness skills, to effectively and skillfully manage peer pressure. And I chose indicators B, C, D, E, G, H, I, and J. You can pause to read those if you want to. So, to begin, we began talking about what is a social norm. So we brainstormed and made a class mind map of various social norms in our society. Students then paired up and discussed norms that are unique to their friend groups. I then asked students what would happen if they didn't follow along with these norms, and why someone might follow along with norms even if they didn't want to. I explained that a large part of why we do this is that our brain is wired to want to belong to a group. Then we watched a quick video demonstrating how weird this phenomena could be, and it was the Brain Games one, where they were in a waiting room and they all had to stand up at the beep and then sit back down. This was an assessment for learning because I was just getting an understanding of what my students already knew about the topic when we were brainstorming for our mind map and discussion questions. And for Bloom's taxonomy, this was understanding the concept and applying it to their friend groups. For lesson 2, what makes a good friend? So we began by brainstorming ideas of what makes a good friend, and then I went through the criteria for this assignment, and they had to make their own magazine covers about their friend of the year. And this was an assessment for learning. I gave the students feedback and circulated around the room to answer questions. It was also an assessment of learning because students were showcasing their understanding of what a good friend is. And so again, this was understanding the concept, but also creating a magazine cover. And so this was the rubric I made for that assignment, and I was able to mark them and put it into the grade book, actually, for their report cards. Lesson 3 was what is peer pressure? I opened this class by reading a story from Chicken Soup for the Soul about a girl who was not a good friend and was peer pressured into betraying someone for popularity. We discussed the story and talked about how peer pressure is not always negative. And then we discussed more in depth 6 different types of negative peer pressure, and then students were given the option of either drawing a picture for each of the 6 types and then labeling it or describing it, or writing a journal entry similar to the story that I read in class about a time that they experienced peer pressure in one of those 6 types. So this was an assessment for learning because I wanted to monitor their understanding of the course content so far. And again, it was understanding the concept, but then also applying it to their own experiences if they chose to do the journal entry. So lesson 4, who experiences peer pressure, was indicator E. We created a diagram of pressures, a Venn diagram of pressures faced by boys and girls, and viewed videos and discussed each. So the one more focused on the girls were the pressures of social media and the body image issues that come because of that, and then the boys were focused more on how they were not able to express their emotions and show vulnerability. And so that led into a discussion on why societal pressures can be problematic for your mental health. The next day, we went over this discussion and I detailed our next assignment, which was researching the pressures faced by a group and then turning it into a brochure. So I made my own example for the students, which I'll show you in the next slide. This was an assessment of learning, as the students were showing me evidence of what they had learned about their topic based on the criteria I provided. So for Bloom's taxonomy, they evaluated their information that I gave them and that they researched and created a brochure with that information. So here was the research paper that I gave them so they could fill out and make sure that they had all of the required information. And then they had to turn it into a brochure. So there's a picture of mine right here, just part of it. And I wanted them to focus on getting all the information, but then also, why would somebody pick up your brochure over anyone else's? And again, I was able to mark all of these little things and put them into the gradebook. So lesson 5 was indicator I. How can I resist peer pressure? I shared with the students various strategies for resisting peer pressure, and then we watched a couple of videos and prepared for a role play activity. So students were organized into groups and were told to come up with a peer pressure scenario and demonstrate 2 ways of resisting that peer pressure. If a group showed me that 2 different ways, then they received a meeting, which is like a 3 out of 4. A 4 is like they went above and beyond. This was an assessment for learning because I just wanted to ensure my students understood the concept or if they required clarification. And so again, this was understanding the concept and applying it to their scenario. The next day we moved on to harassment. I provided a handout on harassment that we read as a class, and then we watched a video where they had to identify the harassment that occurred and how that individual should respond on a worksheet that I gave them. And then I read another story from Chicken Soup for the Soul about harassment and bullying, and we discussed the bystander effect and the importance of not succumbing to it. They then had another question on that sheet asking them to define the bystander effect. This was an assessment for learning because, again, I wanted to know how well my students understood the concept. And for Bloom's taxonomy, understanding the concept and what to do in that situation, and then also remembering the definition of bystander effect. Lesson 7 was passive, aggressive, and assertive behaviors. So I began by asking them to think back and tell me ways that we could resist the bystander effect and take charge in a situation, leading them to discussing having an assertive communication style. So we watched a couple short videos distinguishing between passive, aggressive, and assertive, and then we read a handout as a class. And then I created a Google worksheet where students had to classify a statement as being passive, aggressive, or assertive. This again was assessment for learning because I was getting an understanding of what my students already knew, and we were going to be revisiting it in the next day. For Bloom's taxonomy, this was understanding the concept and then analyzing the various statements and classifying it as one of the 3. And the last lesson was also on passive, aggressive, and assertive behavior. We began this class by doing a quiz where students learned how assertive they were, and then they wrote on whether they agreed or not and why. And then we ended our unit by doing more role plays at the suggestion of my co-op. And I gave them each a scenario, and they had to come up with a passive, aggressive, and assertive response to it in their group. So the role plays were an assessment of their learning for this passive, aggressive, and assertive mini unit within the unit. And the quiz was an assessment as learning because the students were reflecting on their results and themselves. So they were evaluating their quiz results and applying it to their knowledge in the role play scenarios. So in conclusion, I am comfortable creating various assessment tasks, and this was something I really wanted to focus on throughout the 3 weeks because not everybody demonstrates their learning in the same way or has the same strengths. And I would like to, however, focus on differentiating assignments within that. So there was one student who struggled a lot with getting things out in writing, so I asked them to tell it to me verbally. And for the second role plays, I knew that some of the students weren't comfortable performing in front of the class the first time, so I allowed them to just perform it in front of me so they would be a little more comfortable but still get that good mark that they deserved. I also wish I would have incorporated more self and peer evaluations because the brochure, they could have been done in a partner scenario, and I know that sometimes not everybody does their fair share of work. And the student products were better when I went over the rubric, like the magazine covers, versus when I did not. I described the brochure assignment, but I didn't necessarily go over the rubric, and I could tell that there was a lot of confusion because there was a lot of questions. And another thing I need to work on is creating clearer boundaries for giving each mark. So is 50% of the criteria, if 50% of the criteria is done very well, and another student has 100% of the work, but it's not really done to the best of their ability, is that worth the same mark? One thing I learned from this class was trying to get as many assessments in as I could so that their overall mark would be an accurate representation of what they knew. And so I tried to have either an exit slip or a role play or a worksheet or the Venn diagram participation. So they had different ways of showing their knowledge. Thank you for listening.